without further ado, I would like to introduce John Borneman, who is joining us from Berlin, as I understand, to talk to us about dissociation and repression as coping mechanisms for Syrian refugees. John presents his research as a professor of anthropology from Princeton University. He is a well-known and also groundbreaking theorist within the subfields of legal anthropology, political and psychological anthropology. He has conducted fieldwork in different parts of the world, including Lebanon and Syria, but also different countries throughout Central Europe. This research it's a talk that John has written for this seminar. It's part of a book project that is in the making and focuses on how and why refugees resort to two specific coping mechanisms, dissociation and repression, to make sense and also organize their experiences in new diaspora situations. It will be exciting to hear how John will walk us through this, through both mechanisms that deal with unbearable mental health content by, on the one hand, removing oneself from the present through dissociation, disconnecting and losing time thereby, but also repression by excluding unpleasant thoughts and memories. What I find especially compelling also about what we're going to hear is that John will also reflect with us on why refugee studies itself is engaged in dissociation or repression, especially when it turns its eyes to race and colonialism to frame the refugee experience. And then also, of course, here at the UK, we talk a lot about the hostile environment into which we welcome refugees, where they have to fight, where it's very difficult to get status, a process which in and of itself is so distressing that it can have mental health implications. And I'm sure this is the case elsewhere in the world as well. So I'm handing over to you, John, and very excited to hear about your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna, and I want to thank all of the people who were involved in inviting me to present my research. I haven't dealt with this particular material before, at least to an audience. So my project concerns the social incorporation of Syrian refugees who arrived in Berlin during the long summer of 2015. I began ethnographic research that very summer and hope to complete it this year. Hence, this is a longitudinal study where I pay particular attention to processes of incorporation over the last 7 years. The assumption that motivates my questions, stated most abstractly, is that incorporation requires the creation of mutual belonging, which is possible only when both the settled population and the new arrivals modify their expectations and image of the social body of which they are a part. My focus today on dissociation and coping strategies will deal with the one case of a Syrian man who dissociates to maintain his vision of accumulating wealth and of finding a wife. And a second, less detailed case with more context of a German woman who struggles with repression to cope with bringing her own experience with Syrian refugees in sync with the German collective experience as she assists the integration of these refugees. I will unfortunately not have time, and to keep this short, for the last comment you made where I wanted to reflect on refugee studies itself, but we can deal with this maybe in question and answer. So case study 1, Maher. Maher fled Damascus in 2015, applied for asylum, and last fall received citizenship in Germany. He is a carpenter's son, which is how I met him through a mutual friend, also a refugee from Syria. He then became one of my approximately 25 research subjects, all young Syrian men who arrived in Germany around 2015. Such young men comprise 79% of the refugees who arrived that year. Recently, my partner Parvas and I moved into a new apartment, and we needed some light fixtures installed and some bookshelves built. Together with his father, a highly skilled and competent carpenter, Maher spent several days doing this work for us. Maher dreams of wealth, a wealth that would arrive without training or even much work. Now, 7 years after his arrival, these dreams, both in the night and during the day, have become stronger. They have become closer to a vision. His most recent vision is to serve as a mediator, he calls it, for wealthy Arabs, a mediator. That's my English translation, but as you see, he's a bit idiosyncratic here. He would find these wealthy Arabs, he explained to me, and mediate contacts to other individuals who could invest their money in highly profitable ventures. I have had a number of conversations with him together with our mutual friend, conversations that turned into arguments, imploring him to give up this particular vision. Since Maher is very likable, gentle, kind, and trusting, I often feel rude questioning him so aggressively. Our discussions went something like this, translated from German. What makes you think rich Arabs want you to mediate? They have their own ideas about how to invest and with whom. Maher, but I know these people and they make lots of money. Name one person who has made money from this scheme. I know several. Something doesn't make sense to me in what you say, Maher. Why should they pay you? You have no training in finance or investment. Why would they trust you with their money? They can make 30 to 40% on their investments, much more than through banks. I don't trust banks either, but banks are not financial advisors, people who specialize in investment and know the difference between stocks and bonds and novel financial instruments. You know nothing about them. That is specialized knowledge they accumulate with lots of research that others do for them. And even then, they usually cannot deliver such incredible profit margins. I even employ such a financial advisor. But I have seen my friends who make money this way. We hate to say this, but you cannot trust these friends. This is either a Ponzi scheme or more likely a pyramid scheme. They are taking you and their customers for a ride. Maher remained unconvinced. Nothing that we said led him to question the plausibility of this dream. And his premise is plausible. People make money all the time in types of pyramid schemes, where they are the early birds and capitalize by recruiting others to believe the scheme will work for them also. By now, Maher knows that the streets in Berlin are not paved in gold. There are indeed refugees who came to Germany with this understanding, though none who I have met would admit to this to me today. Perhaps those believers who do not belong to the group of mostly middle-class Syrian refugees that I work with, perhaps they don't belong to this particular class. But Maher is also a middle-class refugee, and he did not flee from Damascus to Germany to make money without working or to live off German welfare. The last few years, he has worked on many jobs simultaneously. Now he jobs with a moving company that moves furniture when people buy or rent new apartments. But he also assembles furniture from IKEA and other companies, paints interiors, and assists his father in doing odd jobs like building bookshelves for my apartment. Maher arrived alone in Germany without his father, mother, and 2 younger siblings. The other members of his nuclear family arrived in 2020, at a time when the German economy and society began opening late in the pandemic. Maher says that all he did in those 5 intervening years was think about how to bring his family here from Syria. I wasted those years, he said. I hardly learned any German. I hardly met any Germans. I never went out. I spent all my time on the internet and with Syrian lawyers trying to bring my family here. He knows that German society is organized around specialized training and education. And the years before his family joined him, he visited the job center regularly. That was required in order to receive unemployment assistance. But he acquired no specialized skills, as the job center initially advised him to do. I asked him why he didn't pursue carpentry, a good paying job that he was also good at. He wanted, he replied, to retain flexibility and not commit to a specific training program, which he added he would have had to pay for. And paying for training is or was for him a huge disincentive. From 2015 to 2020, he needed the extra money that he saved from the state's transfer payments to send back to his parents in Syria. His father was unable to find work during the ongoing war, and they lived in constant danger. Moreover, the official sacrifice to train as a carpenter seemed to him onerous. 3 years and 1 day as a journeyman without pay. He knows that acquaintances who get such training are almost sure to earn much more than those who do not. And he has been told, though he may not believe it, that there are ways of financing such training. But instead, he reasoned that during his first 5 years in Germany, his family's survival depended on sending a few hundred euros monthly back to Syria. Maher could also learn about the importance of official training by observing his father's experience since arriving in Germany. His father has skills that are desperately needed now, but these skills alone do not result in employment. There is a huge shortage of skilled craftsmen, but his father lacks a title that would enable him to use his carpentry skills in Germany. Hence, he can only work for minimal pay on the black market. Also, his German is inadequate to be hired on a work group, or so he thinks. The job center concentrates on helping young men and women, not a refugee in his mid-50s. And his father is now paying for a language course. But Maher refuses to learn from the experience of his father or of any others, not when it comes to the accumulation of wealth. No one person and no experience has been able to dissuade him from dreaming of capital accumulation through a pyramid scheme. He calls that line of work, in a novel coinage, mediation, as I said, a term I usually associate with conflict resolution. Here I want to examine how and why Maher is thinking in a way that prevents him from learning from experience. Maher is very conscious of what he is doing, which is why I would think he is engaged in dissociation and not repression. The two ways of coping are similar. Both dissociation and repression refer to failures within the ego, failures at reality testing, failures to transform some sensory impressions into an emotional experience and integrate them into the ego. Analysts usually attribute these failures to happenings or events that radically unsettle or overwhelm. In dissociation, you separate what happened or split the object into good and bad parts to avoid fully registering what happened to you. You do register something of what happened. You do take in certain sensory impressions, but not all of them are registered within your ego. Some impressions are split off from the object you encounter so as not to have to think in the first person of the overwhelming or negative parts of the encounter that unsettle you. In a further step, there is a process Melanie Klein called projective identification. Along with the splitting of the object, you empty yourself of the negative parts by projecting them into someone or something else. In repression, by contrast, you make the entire encounter unavailable to your consciousness, unavailable to your ego. You cannot even remember the details of the encounter with the object. I'm using the word object in the psychoanalytic sense for any person. You and I are objects, for example. Wealth is an object, houses are an object, and you can be your own object. The classic theory of repression would predict symptoms appearing from this repression, and the symptoms continue working in you from the side of the unconscious. They influence how you relate to other objects. Maher has no symptoms of repression, and he does let, as I said, sensory impressions of wealth enter his conscious. But I would maintain he dissociates as he experiences them, allowing the registration of positive but not negative sensory impressions of wealth. Retaining those positive impressions enables him to continue dreaming this particular vision of his future, that he can earn a good living without education or trade, without investing in the difficult work and time necessary to accumulate wealth. He does this because the dream elements are to him plausible. And in refusing to mentalize the complex story of wealth accumulation in Germany today, he severs the plausible from the truth, or from the search for the truth, and thus avoids any reality testing. This truth about how to accumulate wealth in Germany is not hidden or masked as in repression. He sees how it is done everywhere. For example, he sees his friends working to get degrees or in apprenticeship programs. He sees it in the households of people whose furniture he assembles, or in their movements to better apartments or houses. He indeed registers the sight of other people's accumulation, But how this accumulation occurred is not registered. By not acknowledging the difficult truths of how wealth is accumulated, these truths do not become integrated into his ego. That is why I think when I and our mutual friend so aggressively try to dissuade him from his belief in mediation, and I do not think we are the only ones, he is not unsettled. He maintains his belief in mediation despite the fact that he trusts us. If his ego were at stake, he would find our opposition to his idea of mediation more troubling. But his ego is not at stake, and he does not find it troubling that we completely reject his vision. His ego is not at stake because he has split off those truths of wealth accumulation that contradict the plausible claim of making wealth through what he calls mediation. What does he do with our arguments, our reframing of his vision of mediation and wealth into a negative story of a pyramid scheme or a scam? I would assume he is constantly engaged in emptying himself of those negative, disabling thoughts by projecting them into others. In this case, he has projected them minimally into me and our mutual friend, who are the carriers of these unpleasant thoughts. We become the containers for his negative thoughts. This particular way of applying thought through dissociation is not peculiar to matter. I have become alert to its widespread use not only among refugees, but also immigrants. Friends married to immigrants have told me many stories of their spouses acting out of character, surprising them with behavior that was initially hidden from them. Often analysts theorize immigrant experience positively as the strength of bicultural thinking, manifested in a living multiculturalism. The theory goes like this: the new immigrant lives in two alternative, often opposed cultural worlds simultaneously. They sustain a value relativism that allows them to take the best or most appropriate from both worlds. The world of their origin, which is the world of the past, is simply integrated into the foreign world, which is the world of the present. Anthropologists tend to like this framing as it avoids pathologizing immigrants. But this multicultural framing of the immigrant experience tends to minimize the emotional and mental strain of inhabiting two worlds alternately or simultaneously. For most refugees in the 2015 wave, the reality of the new environment has indeed been, in some respects, overwhelming. First, there is all the mental labor in closing the door on the past, on your family and friends, and realizing you cannot return to Syria, perhaps never. But there are also the frustrations in Germany, learning that the simplest things in life are also hard to fathom, either inexplicable or actually too complex to initially understand. These things include renting an apartment, being a roommate, understanding contracts, knowing when behavior is considered offensive or transgressive, learning the kind of boundaries others set in swimming pools or on beaches, how to drive or walk in traffic, when spontaneous visits are acceptable, whether neighbors agree to put the family shoes in the hallway or not. When those quotidian routines are felt to be overwhelming, as too opaque and too numerous, culturally relative coping strategies can fail and result in what we call breakdown. Among the many movies that take up this scenario, an excellent German one is Fatih Akin's 2004 drama, Against the Wall. A young Turkish-German woman cannot cope with the cultural demands of her authoritarian father, who opposes many of the opportunities provided to her by German society. She rebels, marrying a husband who also suffers similar problems. Akin films the action in both Germany and Turkey, insisting that the internal conflict of the protagonist, a conflict produced by her attempt to straddle and live within these two worlds simultaneously, cannot be resolved by being in either of her particular worlds. When she tries to escape this conflict by moving from Frankfurt to Istanbul, she instead carries it with her, and it tears her apart. This is an extreme example, of schizophrenia, a disordered thinking that impairs a correctly ordered interpretation of reality. What I am saying is that dissociation can also be a mental disorder, in which case it is difficult to argue that it contributes to coping. It does not contribute to coping because dissociation is not the result, but the very source of the disorder. Such disorders appear frequently among migrants, given the stress of emotional life, if your perceptions are slightly or totally at odds with those of others in the new environment, or if the conflicts within your internal life hinder any attempt at ego integration. It is rare that this leads to a full-blown schizophrenia, but it is nonetheless a problem, and not only for the individual who is overwhelmed and splits themselves into two, but also for the entire family and network of acquaintances. Dissociation and repression can be, I am arguing, both a sign of the inability to cope and coping strategies for what is overwhelming. But this says nothing about the relative value, temporality, and consequences of particular coping strategies. For example, dissociation may enable you to cope short-term, but it has consequences, negative consequences and effects long-term, as the short-term splitting forecloses possibilities for understanding an external reality that you have limited control over. To return to Maher's way of applying thought about wealth, I am not arguing his thinking is pathological, but I am suggesting it may become so over time. He dissociates not because he is ill, but initially to avoid thinking unpleasant thoughts. Although he is not lazy and he doesn't lack energy, he wants to get rich without putting much effort into it. His friends and I tell him repeatedly that without education, training, or plans for an occupation, you will never earn enough. You will be stuck in menial jobs the rest of your life. You have already learned how to put together IKEA furniture, which is no small task. You can surely train to learn some profession where you have a better future. But Maher resists renouncing this phantasmatic dream of wealth. He resists in order to sustain the pleasure he obtains from thinking of their plausibility. By clinging to a phantasmatic mode of relating to wealth, he avoids any reality testing. His daydreams are thus severed from his reality. He does not, in other words, work through his experience by dreaming his reality. The goal of dreaming, psychoanalysts such as Thomas Ogden have argued, contra Freud's theory, is not to bring their content into conscious reality, but to bring their reality into the dream. The goal is to be able to dream your experience, to place the content of your experience into the work of your dream. Maher does not bring the experiential reality into his dream so that his unconscious can work through it. And he does not bring our arguments critical of his vision into his dreams. Only his fantasies enter his dream world, because there is no reality testing. Truth remains split off from plausibility. The risk for Maher is that his recourse to plausibility, the plausibility that a pyramid scheme will make him wealthy, serves only his immediate pleasure. It is highly unlikely to serve his desires over time. To summarize thus far, dissociation is not a personality type. For people who dissociate, it does not characterize all their interactions with sensory stimuli. It is a strategic mental operation of splitting off a part of yourself. Maher discovered this operation in the diaspora and he has used it selectively. But now discovered, he may in fact resort to it more frequently when he encounters other unpleasant thoughts. I want to share one other area where he dissociates, and that is in his search for love, sex, and marriage. Maher wants to marry badly, and now that he is 34, he thinks about it all the time. He has his own apartment, and he has furnished it well, with a large TV screen and a large, comfortable sofa. But he does not cook, so he eats with his parents nearly every evening. And he has never had sex, Because of his deep religiosity, he cannot allow himself to visit a sex worker, nor engage in casual sex. As a mode of self-discipline, he is committed to praying 5 times a day, irrespective of place or context. Several times in my apartment, he has encouraged me to pray with him. Once, he was so insistent that I agreed, and I did the different poses as well as I could. Healthy movements, I said to him, all familiar as yoga exercises to me, the child's pose, the lotus pose, the upward facing dog. He laughed and agreed, yes, it's a matter of health. The real problem is he wants a woman who is a virgin, a pious Muslim woman with blue eyes, preferably a Syrian woman. He says everything else is unimportant to him. She can be fat or thin, outgoing or reclusive, younger or older, but she must have blue eyes. Few Syrian women of his generation came to Germany in 2015 or after because their families considered it too risky. Now it is difficult to bring them, as individuals usually must finance family reunification, and it is expensive. They do not usually have the money. Moreover, borders are mostly closed, and the illegal routes are unpredictable and dangerous. His wish to find a bride is nonetheless plausible. I say to him, except for the demand of blue eyes. Maher, I say, there are so few Syrian women with blue eyes that you will never find one. He laughs in a way suggesting not humor, but resignation. Similar to how he dreams about wealth, his dream of the blue-eyed Muslim bride is more important to him than the reality of its impossible realization. His sexual desires are unlikely to be fulfilled, and plus his fantasies are likely to become even more repetitive as phantasms. He has, again, like with money, severed any link between the plausibility of the dream and its relationship to truth. I have many other examples, and for sake of time, I will not go into them, of Syrians who did not dissociate and how they managed similar experiences without dissociation is worth elaboration. But instead, it may be more useful to turn to a German experience of the refugee wave, of the reception of refugees, since they are integral for the process of incorporation of the Syrians. So my case number 2 is Heidi. I met Heidi on a beach in Usedom, a city on the Baltic Sea where I was visiting a friend for 4 days. She was very open and immediately shared that she was in treatment for cancer but recovering. The discussion shifted quickly to the issue of refugee resettlement and integration, and she was suddenly simply beside herself, hysterically upset. The more she talked, the more upset she became. It had been nearly 2 years since the high point of this crisis, and Heidi had been volunteering from the beginning to help refugee settlement in Rostock, where she lives. The migrants from many different countries have been bused involuntarily as part of legally mandated distribution to different states within Germany. Rostock was unlikely to be a known destination for them, and that was Heidi's experience also. They all wanted to leave, but the federal government stipulated a period of several years before they had the legal right to move elsewhere without losing their benefits. Heidi had been informed by the same media that informs other Germans that portrayed the refugees as an overwhelming crisis. The threat of immigrant criminality was always in the background, if not a major theme on TV. The same story has been repeated in other European countries. In addition to that, many analysts predicted that the wave of 2015 would turn into a flood. I inferred from the way Heidi talked, jumping hurriedly from one scenario, one problem to the next, that so many foreigners at one time disturbed her sense of orderliness that she shared with others, which has long been cultivated in the German imagination of itself. The difference with Heidi was that she was directly experiencing this crisis, and that an alternative response was being modeled by Chancellor Angela Merkel. Refugees had taken to calling Merkel Mutti, meaning mother, and she did indeed display the qualities of maternal receptivity, such as the capacity for reverie and the maternal alpha function of linking, both of which were integral to creating a counter-narrative to the dominant cautionary tale. To me, though, in our first meeting, Heidi kept repeating, "We're not prepared, we're not prepared." What she meant was that schools were not prepared for the children, the housing had not been prepared for families, the Syrians were unprepared to enter the labor market, the money had not been allocated by the municipalities to carry the burdens of welfare, and on and on. It is not that Germans, at least since World War II, have not had to deal with extraordinary unplanned immigration, what are called spikes in the literature. Francois Erhan has analyzed this extraordinary immigration to Germany over the last 70 years. Unlike other Europeans, Germany has repeatedly experienced huge spikes in immigration that tend to follow decades of ordinary migration. After I made this argument to Heidi, she acknowledged the past, but saw things differently this time around, listing the usually large number of non-Christians as well as the large number of refugees, and that the new arrivals spoke no German and that the majority of them were Muslim. At the same time, Heidi was part of this Willkommenskultur that Merkel had, as a political leader, I won't say introduced, had supported, even though she was verbally critical and skeptical of its effects. Still today, 7 years after the event, ordinary Germans tell me, unprovoked, about the satisfaction of participation in this Willkommenskultur. Only one story here, and a fairly recent one. A librarian, then in his mid-50s, together with his wife, a therapist residing in Berlin, were asked to be legal guardians for a refugee family, 2 parents and 3 children. The librarian did not feel they could afford to risk this, but his wife confronted him and asked if he did not think it important to do something now that they would be very proud of when they were much older. He couldn't say no, he told me. And he claims that this decision is already one of the most memorable experiences of his life, of which he is proud. What is he proud of? Not merely agreeing to vouch for the family legally, but welcoming these strangers into his home, covering their expenses should they have financial problems, and integrating them into his family as friends of equal worth. It goes without saying that every German who was so generous and welcoming has not had the same positive experience with the new arrivals. My point, though, is to emphasize how Heidi and the librarian and his wife did not feel compelled either to repress their negative experiences nor to resort to dissociation, to splitting the self. Heidi was able to make her confusing and disorderly experience of the new arrivals tolerable for her ego. Heidi may have felt at the time we first met that she needed this defense of dissociation, but as she told me the following summer, she was no longer so alarmed. Using Kleinian language, we might say she was progressing through the depressive positions. What makes those who participated in Willkommenskultur capable of an experience that did not require dissociation or repression was their ability to register the event in its fullness, to allow themselves to think the good and bad, the easy and the difficult, as part of the same experience. What I also mean to say is that the welcoming host served frequently as containers for the traumatic experiences of their guests. To serve as containers, they had to link objects, in this case, the beta elements of Syrians, their flight, their needs as refugees in an alien world, and the geopolitics of the moment, to their own beta elements, their anxieties, and quotidian situations. We might say that Willkommenskultur was an attempt to dream the actual encounters with the new arrivals, to make those experiences digestible in the unconscious, to make them not merely into a cognitive, but also an emotional experience. This waking dream served not as a classic defense, but as a space to think in opposition to a social world that kept telling everyone that the barriers and obstacles to incorporate those refugees were insurmountable. Finally, I want to reflect on my own role in the mental health of these particular individuals and the groups to which they belong. Both individual Syrians and Germans are now members of the same nation, independent of their different subjective understandings of membership. If dissociation is not always a defense that becomes an illness, it is a coping strategy that is not always pathological, then my own role as professional anthropologist, friend, and intellectual should be to help Syrians think through whether the strategy is serving them well, which does not mean disabusing them of all of their fantasies and illusions. Matter operates in the phantasmatic register in minimally two spheres of his life, in wealth accumulation, impacting his understanding of the economic system in which he lives, and in love and marriage, the system of affinity in which he feels cared for and nurtured. In the economic sphere, I take it as my ethical duty to disabuse him of pyramid schemes that rely on a phantasmatic distancing from reality, and is likely to make him suffer in the long term. In the sphere of affinity, who am I to dissuade him from seeking a blue-eyed Muslim wife? It may be that he unconsciously does not want to get married, or that he unconsciously does not desire women. That is for him alone to decide, and I take my role to be the empathic and perhaps amused listener, and only that. For Heidi and all the other Germans who found the entrance of all of these refugees overwhelming, I have felt more compelled to clarify their ambivalences to them, to reassure them when they are unnecessarily alarmed, but also to argue with them, using the entire power of my intellectual training, using facts and logic, not hiding my own emotional investments, to disabuse them of assumptions based on a false empirical base. I also consistently argue against thinking that the new arrivals will not change, as those changes are unavoidable, as well as dependent on the progressive development of a relationship of mutual belonging to Germany and Germans. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I very much would look forward to your comments and reactions.
Thank you very much, John, for such a thought-provoking talk and the images that it evoked, just beautiful. Before we start the Q&A, just to say for those of you who joined a bit later, I'm Hannah Kienzler. I'm together with my colleague Craig Morgan, co-director of the Centre for Society and Mental Health. So welcome everyone. If you would like to raise a question, please raise your hand, put the question into the chat, and we can help to unmute you. So there's Kate. Kate, would you like to unmute yourself and pose your question, or do you prefer me to read it out? Maybe Verity has to actually unmute you. All right, I'll read it out. So Kate, it says, thank you for the very interesting lecture. Can I please ask, what is the epistemological position of this qualitative research? Is it interpretive phenomenology or psychoanalysis? Or else, I suppose.
Okay, well.
Shall we start with that one?
Okay, so for me, it's not important, maybe it was earlier in my career, to be very specific about what intellectual lineage I was drawing from. So one thing I have decided, maybe, I don't know, my last project was on a book called Cruel Attachments I wrote on men who have been accused and are therefore required to do therapy for child sex abuse. And I realized I had to understand psychoanalysis in depth to understand what the therapists were thinking they were doing. So therefore, I invested heavily, although I've always been interested in psychological anthropology, but specifically the psychoanalytic and not the psychological approach. And I thought one of the contributions I could make, since there are so many taboos around psychoanalysis, is to be very upfront about it. And specifically, not just Freud, which is oftentimes where people get stuck, but the huge literature since Freud and the different directions psychoanalysis has taken. So on the one hand, as an anthropologist, I'm much committed to thick description, to the idea that there's a theory behind description, and that the description is important. It should be inviting. It should cover things that go beyond the particular question I'm asking, that it also contains myself and how I elicit information, or what kind of relationships I develop, that the reader, listener can judge for themselves how I'm learning. Right? If that's adequate to them as an epistemology, like, is it truthful? Is it, what does it exclude or include, et cetera? So that combined with psychoanalysis is basically, psychoanalysis, of course, is a form of interpretation. It is, that's what it is. It's a theory of interpretation of the mind. And I think, to me, it's the most precise language. And that's why I dealt with terms, say, like containment, which doesn't come up that often, but anybody, since so many of you are involved in refugee or immigrant research, if you're dealing directly with refugees or migrants, you're being asked to contain their emotional states very, very often. What does that mean for epistemology? What can you learn from being put in that position about the kinds of emotional conflicts that they feel need containing, because they will project them into you. So that's just one example.
Thank you, John. And Kate, thought your answer was also inspiring. While people are thinking of their questions, I would like to pose one. I was very intrigued by your presentation, your paper, and sort of thinking about this notion of the lack of preparedness. Also, I suppose I have that image in front of me of someone kicking the can down the road, and connected to this sort of thoughts around structural discrimination and racism, where you don't actually have to talk about it, but you can engage in a behavior that outwardly seems to suggest that you're actually caring, that you would like to provide the best, but at the moment you can, that's really distressing to you. So actually, so this kind of conundrum sort of captured me. And I was also wondering how this kind of narrative is coming across for the refugees themselves. How do they respond to this kind of notion around the lack of preparedness and distress of their hosts, while it results for them in forms of possibly exclusion or discrimination? So I'm not sure if I'm pulling things together that you're not pulling together, but I would love to hear you speak a bit more about these issues.
So, I find it very important to understand experience. And really, experience is what the empirical is. So when positivists say this number is based on an empirical study, it's an abstraction from experience. It's not experience. And I'm interested in the question you just asked, that part, that what is their experience? And if I want to start with that, experience is messy. You don't have an experience, things happen to you. It has to become experience. So this is why you need psychoanalysis or some kind of processual thinking to understand how people take what happens to them and make it into an experience. In other words, something they can claim that it has a coherence to it, it's integrated somehow, and they can talk about their role in it. I experienced this, right? Not just it happened. And so if I take that as my premise, that I'm really interested in the experience. Now, when I started off my talk, I gave a very abstract one-sentence description of my project. Okay, so that moves so far away from experience, but I'm interested in the experience of incorporation and not simply incorporation. Right. So in other words, it's not simply whether they can, in an opinion, claim they're members of Germany or they got citizenship, a passport, but in what way do they feel this? And is that feeling at all reciprocated by Germans they meet, who Syrians oftentimes say to me, used to say much more than they have now, that they are now. They will never think I'm German because I'm not blonde. Well, most Germans are not blonde either, but doesn't matter. Their hair is too dark. Their framing is too dark with their eyebrows, and their beards are fuller oftentimes, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay. And in that sense, you know, phenotypically or whatever, they may be right. But at the same time, of course, many Germans are married to not Germans, to people from the Mediterranean, if not Middle Easterners. And their children, you know, what do they say? They can keep saying, I'm not German too, if they want to, but oftentimes they are. They're behaving in very German ways. They picked up many things from the environment, which you can't help but. So if taking that approach, the most Syrians initially only met the people who were prepared at least emotionally to deal with them. They're the ones who volunteered. They're the ones who were put in positions. What's interesting is that the state then, as it tried to organize different housing and other help with agencies, relied increasingly on people who shared their language. But that was Egyptians, Tunisians, Moroccans, but people who are not recent immigrants. And they were oftentimes very hostile. So they were very prepared for them to understand what they're saying, but they're in a very different location than the Germans who were unprepared. They couldn't speak to them. But like Heidi, she knew they needed something from her, right? So this idea of preparedness, in one way, we're never prepared adequately for these kind of refugees, even if it's only two that you meet. But at the same time, they experienced the level of preparedness that they were impressed with, I have to say, that they were very impressed with. And I'm dealing with middle-class refugees, right? The experience may be other for people who didn't have this capacity to understand what Germans were giving them, right? Even when it wasn't always nice. So, you know, there's the story of early in one of the refugee camps up in Rügen, an island, where they were given not enough to eat. And they were refugees from all over, not just Syrians. They were always mixed. And so one complained and said, you know, this is not enough to eat. And he said, you can't treat us this way. You know, I can speak in 6 languages. And went down, you know, what he could do. And here he is, a 21-year-old kid. And he said, I've lived now in 3 countries. And so, you know, respect me. And the next day, the people he had talked to, one of them came up to him and said he appreciated this. So even though, right? So the point is, they weren't prepared, but he knew this then and dealt with them as people who weren't quite prepared, right? They weren't prepared to treat them as equals, say, or equally needy or whatever. So that's the general thrust here, is to focus on experience, and that this idea of unpreparedness is strained by the Stimmung, the atmosphere around them, as much as their own experience. And that's what I wanted to get across with Heidi. She was actually, of course, she was stressed from all of the things they had to deal with in this initial couple years, with people constantly arriving and being totally unprepared for the setting, and the setting and being unprepared for them. But she dealt with it. And the other thing is structural racism, and the idea of taking structure as an adjective now. I grew up in the time where structuralism was a movement, a formal operation to understand unconscious structuring that wasn't available in observation. So, okay, but it's not, doesn't mean that today. It means precisely a non-experiential view of the situation. In other words, there's something structuring it that is, if not permanent, extremely strong, but it doesn't depend on your experience. you may have bad experiences because of it, but that is not the proof. The epistemology, to go back to the first question, is there in other data, like opinion polls. It could be arrests if it's about police, it could be housing allocation, right? But the experience isn't there. And the only way we change the world is through our experience. So unless you can communicate structural racism as an experience, then I don't hold a lot of value in it. An analysis around these ideas of structure without the experience seems to me to be limited. And if not often counterproductive, because if people keep saying, I'm not having that experience when we claim it is, because we have all this data to show it doesn't seem to have any effect.
Thank you. And sort of in the interest of time, I was wondering, Georgia, we had a bit of an insight in aspects of racism. And I think Gida's question speaks to that as well to some extent. And so I'm going to read Gida's questions, but sort of add Georgia's ask as well to this. So Gida asked me to read it out. Thank you for such an interesting paper and speaking to the experience of migrants and refugees. I'm myself a Syrian migrant and psychologist, and found this speaks to my own experience, something I've worked through personally. Could you speak to how you managed the tension between using perhaps a colonial theory of understanding to speak to the experience of refugees in this context? And Georgia asked you if you could expand a bit on what you were not able to cover in the talk, how dissociation and repression happens in academia as it turns to race and colonialism in framing the refugee experience. So I think these questions are to some extent related.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
That's another bit of intellectual effort to relate them. So the first one, I don't quite understand what colonial theory is. When I'm using that's a colonial theory. Yeah, I mean, I don't know where that question's coming from. But in terms of my own, what I just presented, I didn't present to my subjects. I presented this to an audience that specializes in mental health issues, and therefore the language is definitely not the language I would use in talking to people who if they want to, but it's not my role to put them in a position of being students or intellectual colleagues unless they want that. So with Maher here, in my attempt to disabuse him of the thinking of a pyramid scheme as a way to, I didn't even use I use the word pyramid scheme, but it's not an intellectual word. So the language is important to whom you're speaking, and that, yeah. In terms of the question of dissociation and repression in the academy, well, there are all these examples of not wanting to deal with the difficulties of immigrant experience. I mentioned simply the difficulty of thinking that one is pathologizing the people one studying, but that's why I'm not talking about pathologizing individuals, but there are behaviors that are self-harming. And it's very important that people are aware of them, even though the first reaction, if I would say that to somebody, is to be defensive, to say, no, that's not what I'm doing, but they are, and they're, so then there has to be an exchange to convince this person, or at least to get them alert to think through whether they're harming themselves by not getting any training. And I have this conversation quite often with people about, not pursuing training for short-term objectives, like the pressure to support the families, or back in Syria or in Jordan or even in Turkey, and therefore they're not themselves pursuing the training that German society would demand of them to have decent paying jobs. So yeah, so what I'm referring to here is the fact that oftentimes these unpleasant not unpleasant, limited understandings of one's own situation, which are hard to understand to begin with, they're oftentimes repressed. So in order to not celebrate, but to come up with a gloss that's not embarrassing, where one's not risking anything, right? There are certain cautions in the academy today, having to do with language also, that means people don't avail themselves of the full picture. And so dissociation would be where the academic speaks what a wonderful experience they've had with these different immigrants, and that happens too. But that's all, and they don't talk about what else the experience was for them, or even the experiences of the immigrants if they're not just suffering, and certainly if they are, they try to get out of that. So I had a student who did a dissertation in Bosnia on right when the war ended and the international community withdrew after being there for a year or two, especially mental health workers and whatnot. And they felt abandoned, of course, by the lack of aid and by all of the different people who worked in different NGOs. And he focused on Wings of Hope, a particular organization that was to give them hope. But everything he described was despair. And I said to him, I said, how can you do this? And he himself had like 1.5 years of depression when he came back, because it was so depressing, the situation. Everybody was just loading on him. He's a very empathic person, and they were making him contain all this disappointment. And so he focused on Wings of Hope. And that's what I mean by a kind of dissociation, that a fuller picture would have focused at least half on despair. And repression is just another side of this, where that's simply not allowed even to surface in their in their writing or talk. I mean, the example I gave of hiring other immigrants who share the same language to do the administration. Another student of mine wrote a paper.
John?
Are we too long?
We're running out of time.
Okay. That's for another time.
That's for another time. We have to invite you back. Thank you so very much for this interesting talk, fascinating, complexifies experiences, shows different facets that are sometimes uncomfortable and yet so important to engage with. So thank you very much. Thank you also to the audience for attending, for all your questions and comments and kind feedback. So thank you again very much, John. Thank you everyone for attending this talk, and let's keep in touch. Let's keep the conversation going.